centre.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to participate in this debate. I want to do so by concentrating really on two aspects of the legislation and of the situation which the member who's just spoken and others have talked to. I want to say to the government that this is a bill that causes me a great deal of concern, not because it's illegitimate or inappropriate for governments to be concerned about the security of Canada. In fact, that is a primary responsibility of the federal government and a responsibility that all of us have to take very, very seriously. But it's because the methods and definitions that are used in this bill are going to have a significant impact on a number of people who are not themselves smugglers, as the term has been used by the government, and who are, in fact, people fleeing for their lives from difficult situations. And in particular, I want to discuss at this point in time, Mr. Speaker, the situation in Sri Lanka, because we wouldn't be having this discussion if two boats had not arrived over the last several months, years, in which a number of Tamil Sri Lankans of Tamil origin came to Canada on these boats. It's important for us to stop dancing around the issue and understand that were it not for that particular circumstance, we would not be having this debate and we would not be having this discussion, and the government would not be presenting this legislation. So to talk about this legislation without talking about the situation in Sri Lanka, what happened in Sri Lanka, and what is taking place there today would be a little bit like talking about Moby Dick without mentioning a white whale. As members here will know, I have spent many months in Sri Lanka over the last several years. I was involved, together with a number of other Canadians and international constitutional experts, in advising the constitutional process or the negotiating process that came out of the ceasefire in Sri Lanka that took place and was negotiated by the Norwegians in 2001. And in the course of that work, I had the opportunity to spend a great deal of time in the whole country. I also met with, on several occasions, with the political leaders in the country on all sides, and have had an opportunity since then to follow on a regular basis the events that are taking place in the country. I'm not going to go over the entire political history of Sri Lanka, except to say that the period in which I was there, the period of the ceasefire, was a brief interregnum of nonviolence during a 25, 30-year, very, very difficult, violent civil war in which literally tens of thousands of people were killed, mainly in the north, but including civilians in the south, where, yes, acts of terrorism were carried out against civilians, and very significant bombing and damage and death occurred and destruction occurred as a result of the war carried out by the government of Sri Lanka, as well as carried out by the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, as they're called, or better known as the Tamil Tigers. Mr. Speaker, the ending of that war was a subject of considerable debate in this House. We had several debates in the House. We had many questions in question period about it, and not only in this House, but indeed in parliaments and legislatures around the world. The question of what exactly happened at the end of that conflict, in which certainly by any estimation several thousand people were killed in the last few days, estimates range anywhere from a few thousand to as high as 30 or 40,000, and those numbers are contested by all sides and debated by all sides. But nevertheless, it's clear that there was a significant loss of life at the very end of the war. It's also interesting to me that as recently as the last few days, Prime Minister Cameron of the United Kingdom has called for an investigation into possible war crimes that may or may not have taken place at the end of that war. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, has appointed a panel of experts to look into the question and to advise him to look into the question of what happened and what are the possible consequences with respect to the conduct of the government of Sri Lanka as well as the conduct of the LTTE. That panel has not been welcomed by the government of Sri Lanka. In fact, its very existence has been challenged as the subject of considerable debate in Sri Lanka, and the government of Sri Lanka has also appointed a commission that is supposed to be looking into the question of what it is that actually happened in those last days. From the perspective of the government of Sri Lanka, the war is simply over. The conflict is at an end. There are still several thousand people in large refugee camps, but many people have been rehoused and moved out and away from the 300,000 people who were in the camp at the end of the conflict. At the same time, it's fair to say that political power is being consolidated at the central level, and as colleagues will certainly know, that the government of Sri Lanka not only has not been particularly enthusiastic about allowing in the members of the panel from the Secretary General of the United Nations, but the members will also know that despite the fact that I had a valid visa issued by the High Commission of Sri Lanka, I myself was not permitted to enter the country when I arrived at Colombo Airport some several months ago. I'm sure that other members, perhaps in other parties, have since been allowed to go, but I regret very much that that I was not able to go last June when I attempted to do so. I must confess, I don't say these words with even a degree of personal resentment at the fact that this took place, but rather at the fact that when I was not allowed in, it was because I was deemed to be a threat to the security of the country. So when I hear others described as a threat to the security of the country, I only have to say, well, that's what they call me. And so I have to say to honourable members, I hope people will think through very carefully in trying to understand some of the motivation, some of the issues, some of the human problems, some of the suffering, some of the sense of threat to life and limb, which has historically led people to flee a country and to seek refuge and to seek harbor somewhere else. Now, the minister who's sitting in the House, and I respect the fact that he's here listening to the debate. I've always respected that approach.
Want to bring to the attention of the member from Toronto Centre and others that it's not our practice to draw attention to whether members are or are not in the chamber.
I certainly know that. If you think after 32 years I would have figured out how to do this. I simply wanted to point out the fact that I appreciated that there were some people who are here who, in my experience, who other ministers are not always here when we're discussing matters of a bill, and I appreciate the minister's respect for parliamentary tradition. But I want to emphasize that it is not possible for this House to debate the question of the appropriateness of this legislation unless we understand what exactly is taking place in the country from which people are fleeing and which are now the subject of the sanctions in this bill. This is why we're discussing this legislation. And I just think it's not possible to have a serious discussion about this bill without understanding that in Europe, that in the United Nations, that in the United States, that in virtually every country in the Western world, significant concerns have been expressed and are being expressed about the human rights situation historically in Sri Lanka and even today in Sri Lanka. And it's an illusion to think that this is not a problem or something we should not be discussing. This government has remained significantly silent on this topic. We have not heard anything from this government with respect to the circumstances surrounding the end of the war. We've not heard anything from this government with respect to whether or not it's fully supportive of the decision of Ban Ki-moon to name a panel. We've not heard any response to the call from the British Prime Minister with respect to the need for war crimes investigation. I don't know why there's that reluctance, Mr. Speaker. I don't know why a government which in many respects and from insignificant moments in the life of this House has spoken clearly about democracy and has spoken clearly about human rights. I don't know why the government would have such difficulty in this particular situation. It cannot be that because there was a violent conflict and because one party to that conflict was the LTTE, it cannot be that the standard to which we hold the Sri Lankan government can be any less or any lower. It cannot be that because we have appropriately designated the LTTE as a group which practiced terror, which believed in violence, which believed in the appropriateness of killing civilians or of using civilians as targets and as shields in the course of a war, which believed it was appropriate to strap bombs on the backs of young 13-year-old women and send them into a market and send them into a bazaar. There never can be an apology or an expression of support for that kind of tactic or that kind of approach to life. We should be very clear about that. And as speaking as someone who's lost dear friends to these acts of terror, I have no hesitation in being critical of them and being critical of that. But that is never an excuse for repression. That is never an excuse for oppression. And it is not an excuse for the killing of civilians. And we would not be seeing the numbers of people that are getting on those boats if there wasn't a problem in Sri Lanka. And anybody who says that we're not worried about that, or we're not going to express a concern about that, or that's not part of what we need to discuss, is simply not facing up to the reality of the situation. So I would ask the government to use its offices of investigation and its offices in its capacity. I would like the government to remain deeply sensitive to the challenge that the Tamil community still faces in Sri Lanka, and to be aware of some of those circumstances, and to be aware of the pattern of increasing the political power at the center that every sensible observer, from the International Crisis Group to Amnesty International to Human Rights Watch to the United Nations itself, has been expressing concern about the underlying challenge, the problem of human rights in Sri Lanka.
If there wasn't a problem of civil rights in Sri Lanka, then we wouldn't have the refugee problem we have now. We cannot discuss this situation in the House of Commons or the proposed bill before us without speaking of the situation in Sri Lanka. We have to discuss it honestly and openly. We have to have these discussions. We have to hold this dialogue. It's essential.
Mr. Speaker, is that the government has told us, and the member who just spoke referred to it very directly, to say that the purpose of this bill is to increase the severity of punishment for what they call human smuggling. Now, Mr. Speaker, in the history of immigration and in the history of the movement of populations, it is very important for the government of Canada and for the people of Canada to express a strong view about people being paid money in order to bring many, many others to Canada and to portray them as refugees. But as my colleague has said from Etobicoke Centre, two of the most dramatic examples of the arrival of boats in this country, which the member who was asked about it simply dismissed as saying, well, that's history. Well, not exactly. Pointed out, when the Komagata Naru was posted outside in Vancouver and then was not allowed in, people were not allowed to disembark, people were not allowed to stay. Eventually the boat went back, and when they went back and they arrived in India, hundreds were killed. And we know from the plight of the St. Louis that of the 900 who were not allowed to land in Havana, were not allowed to land in Miami, and were not allowed to land in Halifax, we know that of that group, probably as many as 300 were killed in the Holocaust. A lot of studies have been done on both these experiences. So when the member says, go ask your constituents how they feel, I have to say to Mr. Speaker, well, how did Canadians feel in 1914? And how did Canadians feel in 1939? And we always have to say to ourselves, these are not easy issues. And I have no doubt at all in my mind that there are a great many of my constituents who would say, if they were told about this legislation, would say, that's good. But it's only when we think it through that you have to sort of say, well, is this really what we should be doing? And that's where I have a problem. I have a problem because the law is not just about smuggling, the law is also about refugees. It creates two classes of refugees. And that's the weakness of the law, and in my view, it's the flaw of the law, and in my view, it's a flaw which the courts will attack front and center. Front and center because it's not just about the Charter, it's also about our international obligations. We have signed covenants with respect to the rights of children and with respect to the rights of refugees. We cannot simply say that because you came over in this boat, we will put you in a different category, you will be designated by the minister, and you will not be able to do what other refugees can do or what other people who are applying for refugee status can do or who are seeking to be refugees can do. And it's this creation of two classes which is the central weakness and flaw of the bill, in addition to the fact, Mr. Speaker, that the legislation as a whole and the discussion as a whole does not deal, in fact, with the problem where it lies. Now, it is equally important for us, Mr. Speaker, to deal with one other issue, and that is the issue of queue jumping. Because there's nothing more, I think, basic to a Canadian sense of fairness than to say that we don't want people jumping the queue, that is to say, trying to come in as immigrants when there are other people who are patiently waiting in their countries of origin. But it has to be understood. There is no queue line for refugees. There is no queue line. These are two different things. And that's where, again, I think the government has used language, quite creatively, I might add, which is intended to say to Canadians, we've got to create a situation which is fair to everyone. And I agree, we have to create a situation which is fair to everyone. But I, for one, question legislation which creates two separate categories of refugees, treats people who come over in certain boats in a certain way, and people who come over by plane or in another boat in another way. And I think the government is not being upfront with the people of Canada when it suggests that what is taking place is any form of queue jumping. If there's a refugee process that's well managed and that has enough people there to manage the flow of people who are coming in and asking to be refugees, If you're not accepted as a refugee, you go back to your country of origin, and that's it. We send back hundreds, if not thousands of people, Mr. Speaker. Nobody should be under any illusions about that. This legislation is more about politics than it is about dealing with a real problem. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Minister of Citizenship and Immigration.
Thank the member of Toronto Centre for his comments. Always a thoughtful member, Mr. Speaker, and in particular, let me say that I agree with much of what many of his comments with respect to the conflict in Sri Lanka, the need for a just and durable settlement that respects the legitimate aspirations of the Tamil people, and that responds to the many serious concerns about human and civil rights violations. I spoke to that at the beginning of my speech in introducing this bill yesterday, and I did discuss the ongoing efforts of Canadian diplomats and members of this government's executive branch to do everything we can to ask the Sri Lankan authorities to deal with these issues in a transparent and serious manner. I entirely agree with him. Having said that, I think it's important to underscore that the bill does not deal with any particular source country. Secondly, in dealing with that issue, I wonder if the member would care to comment or reflect on the fact that since the cessation of hostilities last year, over 100,000 Tamil Sri Lankan refugees who were under the protection of India, principally in Tamil Nadu, have since returned to Sri Lanka. The UN High Commissioner on Refugees has said that Tamil refugee claimants can no longer be presumed to have a bona fide claim. That the UNHCR has also facilitated the return to Sri Lanka of many Tamil asylum claimants who were under temporary protection in Southeast Asia. Similarly, a CBC report last week indicated that Tamils living in India had paid smugglers to come to Canada, in part, in their words, for economic reasons. And finally, that according to a CBSA survey, a significant majority of successful Tamil asylum claimants in Canada have subsequently returned to the country which they claim to flee for reasons of fear of persecution. So could he comment on the fact that the situation, according to the UN and other international observers, has improved appreciably from a point of view of safety, but I agree with them, there continue to be very serious issues that must be dealt with. Finally, and very briefly, the analogies to the St. Louis and Komagata matter, quite frankly, border on demagoguery. Neither of those situations have any relevance to this, Mr. Speaker. We would
Order. The Honourable Member for Toronto Centre.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Minister's very kind. I mean, at one point in his speech he says how thoughtful I am, and at the end of his speech he calls me a demagogue. So I'm not sure which it is. I wish the Minister would make up his mind. I can handle the praise and the criticism either one, but I just wish you'd make a thoughtful demagogue. I guess that's the opposite. Well, let me just say to the Minister on the first point, the Minister is absolutely correct. That of course the situation has changed, but let's be candid. The situation has changed because there's been a considerable consolidation of power in Sri Lanka, significant centralization of power. Continued repression. It's still a very dangerous place to be a journalist. It's a very dangerous place to express opposition and differing views. But I also think it's a constantly evolving situation. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that there's an automatic presumption that the people who came over in the circumstances that they came over in over the last 18 months, the two boats that are the subject of this legislation, I'm not suggesting that there's a presumption that any one of them is a refugee. I'm simply saying that there is a need to consider their claim. There's a need to make sure that we have a sufficient number of officers and those people who can review the case in time to get it done, and that's the approach that needs to be taken to regulate that particular situation. We can debate the question of the other boats in our history. The one boat that I would not want the Minister to ignore is the comments that were made by former Prime Minister Mulroney at the time that the boat came to Newfoundland. And at that point, the government of the day decided that they would grant almost immediate resident status to the people who claimed, and Mr. Mulrooney said it was done in a spirit of generosity, realizing and remembering the historic traditions of the country. If I may say so, quite a significantly different tone than the one struck by the current Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Mississauga South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for his thoughtful commentary on a very important bill. And he did make a couple of points which I hope that all members will recall, that you can't paint all refugees and refugee circumstances and countries with the same brush. I listened carefully to the speech of the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety, and I was a little disturbed that he invoked a number of images of gun crime, violent offenders, profits of the funds used for illicit criminal activities, and tended to paint a picture that what we're talking about in this bill is about refugees and all of these terrible things that are associated with refugees. And, Mr. Speaker, the member read that speech, and that means it comes from the Minister's office, which means it comes from the Prime Minister's office. And I guess my question is quite frankly, is there a sense, on behalf of the honourable member, that maybe the government isn't being totally forthright with the House with regard to its attitude towards refugees generally?
The honourable member for Toronto Centre.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the central flaw in the bill, as I've tried to suggest, is this. First of all, the government did not invent the crime or offence of human smuggling. Human smuggling is an offence which is now punishable up to life imprisonment. We haven't had many convictions of it, but nevertheless to suggest that this is some new law, some new crackdown which is taking place, is more illusion than reality. The reality is we already have a law. We have a law that's already in place. And the other flaw is that the bill has much more to do with how refugee applicants who come over in boats of this kind are treated. That is to say, detention for up to a year, being treated in a separate channel, a separate class. Once you've been designated, it creates a new class of people who've been designated by a minister because of the circumstances in which they've come. It gives extraordinary power and discretion to the minister to label a group or to label a particular circumstance, and then it then puts those people in a separate stream, and they're then treated in a completely separate way that is entirely discriminatory in comparison to how other refugee applicants are to be treated. And that's why I don't believe this meets the test. I don't think it meets the test.
Questions and comments? The honourable member from Trinity Spadina. Short question, please.